All right. I think we are now live. Welcome everybody. But as is customary in our new Zoom reality, we're just going to wait a minute or two for the stragglers to make it into our conversation. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Think Global, Act Local, Lessons for Museums in the 21st Century conversation with Andras Szanto. I'm Adam Levine, the director of the Toledo Museum of Art. I come to you from snowy Toledo. It's snowy in so many parts of our country right now, and could not have known how apposite the work of art behind me by Gustav Fjestad would have been when it was selected as the backdrop for this Zoom. For those of you who know the Toledo Museum of Art, you'll know that this is an exceptional institution with a deep past, founded in 1901, and in this building, sort of magnificent Edward Green building, since 1912. But that history and the scope of time is just a blip. The objects we steward represent thousands of years of history, and that's a history which is matched by the duration of the occupancy on the land that the museum now occupies. And it's important for us at the museum to acknowledge that the institution is located on the ancestral homelands of the Kickapoo, Erie, Ottawa, and Seneca. We recognize that many other Native tribes have also conducted trade on and called this region their home, including the Fox, Lenape, Miami, Ojibwe, Peoria, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and Wyandot. We at the Toledo Museum of Art acknowledge and honor the past, present, and future lives of Indigenous peoples in the Toledo area and thank them for their resilience as stewards of the land on which the museum's campus now resides. As a cultural institution, it's our responsibility and aim to understand and continually share knowledge about the complicated history of the space we now occupy, the peoples who are here before us, and the enduring presence and diversity of Indigenous peoples in our region. In keeping with the museum's vision of creating a culture of belonging, we commit to building meaningful relationships with Indigenous communities and working to dismantle the systemic invisibility of Indigenous and other peoples. In devising this statement and writing the history of this land, we've learned a lot, but this is not the end of the process. Through shared knowledge and exchange, we'll continue to learn and enrich the history as we come to know more. Continuous and lifelong learning is at the core of what museums do, and we thank all of you for being here today to do just that. Our programming for this entire season is generously supported by ProMedica, and this conversation has been graciously sponsored by Christie's. So thanks to both of those partners who are both represented in the audience here today. We are also, of course, joined by the esteemed thinker and strategist and a dear friend of mine, Andras Szanto. Andras is a widely published author who advises museums, foundations, and educational institutions. He has worked here at the Toledo Museum of Art before, and I have been fortunate to work with Andras on several projects. He also consults for corporations on cultural strategy and program development worldwide. I think the greatest indicator of how brilliant and terrific Andras is that he doesn't have a client once, he has a client for life and does work with so many extraordinary organizations. He earned his PhD in sociology from Columbia University. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, Art Forum, ArtNet, and the Art Newspaper, among many others. He lives in Brooklyn, and as a consultant, he advises some of the world's leading cultural institutions and corporate art programs. He has lectured on art business at the Sotheby's Institute of Art and has directed the National Arts Journalism program at Columbia University. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art, he helped launch and oversee the Global Museum Leaders Colloquium, a series of 10-day seminars for international museum directors. He is a frequent moderator of the Art Basel Conversation series. Born in Budapest, he has curated exhibitions on Hungarian art of the 60s and 70s in London and New York. His most recent book, which is the subject of this conversation, is The Future of Museum by Hatice Kans, and I'm looking forward to discussing with him. Welcome, Andras.
Thank you, Adam, and what a special pleasure it is for me. I think it's the first event, hopefully not the last, we're doing together now that you're in this role. And it's really meaningful for me having intersected with you in so many different ways and so many different guises at the Met as in your early days. But I also want to acknowledge all the other people who make such an event happen, not to mention make a book happen. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Though speaking of that book, we have a number of copies signed and unsigned. So please consider purchasing one if you haven't already. Likewise, as Colin Stegman, whom we thank for putting this entire event together. Thank you, Colin. He's hiding as the TMA education account. As he just put in the chat, we encourage you to ask questions in real time. Andras and I have known each other for about 10 years. While we have some sense of where we're going in this conversation, we're going to freewheel it a little bit, and we're going to do our best to layer any questions that you put into the Q&A into our conversation in real time. We will reserve some time at the end to pick out questions that we weren't able to address in real time, or questions that you submit in a dedicated Q&A. But please, we want to keep this engaging and dialogic. So send questions in as you have them. But with that, let's turn to the formal program. And Andras, so the first and somewhat most obvious question is, how did you come up with the idea for this book?
Well, I always wanted to do a book about museum directors. I find them fascinating people, but more importantly, I find museums fascinating people. And as you mentioned, I'd been involved in convening international groups of museum directors at the Met on 4 occasions. These were quite large groups for very long periods of time, and we went very deep in these conversations at what was called the Global Museum Leaders Colloquium. And I was fascinated to see what were some of the issues the directors got excited about talking about. And they were rarely about, how to hang pictures on walls, although of course they're very keenly interested in how to grow their collections. But the energy in the room usually exponentially increased around topics like education and public outreach and the intersection of the museum with society and politics and technology and all these new edges of museum practice. And ever since then, I'd wanted to put together a book like this, but the most immediate impetus was the epidemic. Almost exactly a year ago, I wrote an article that was very widely read. We were already on lockdown, and I began talking about, it would be really nice to open museums. And I kept hearing from museum directors. You were one of them that I spoke to a lot at the time. And so I thought, look, if there ever is a time to do a book of conversations, this is it. We all have the time. The directors have time. They're not traveling. But most importantly, everybody's curious what the future will bring. So I wasn't interested in a book about the pandemic, although it's an interesting, artifact of that moment. But it was a natural moment to ask, where is this field going? We knew that there was an inflection point. I think this is true in so many areas of life. It seemed like the right time to ask the directors, what is the future of the museum?
Well, I also think it's characteristic of your approach to things. So rather than sitting and simply opining, you actually asked sort of the folks who are giving some thought to this issue every day. So that begs the question, there are thousands of museum directors around the world, and you indeed know hundreds of them. So how did you decide who to interview?
Yeah, well, I mean, in retrospect, those who read the book, they were all, each of these interviews has a little introduction. And even I was struck by how many of these people are people I've known a long time. You're somebody I've known 10 years. There are people in this book I've known 30 years. And that was a helpful thing, but there were really a couple of maybe 3 things that really helped determine the selection criteria, if you will. One was we really wanted this to be a book about the future, not so much looking back at the great accomplishments of museums in the past. And indeed, I was fortunate that my publisher had recently published a book of conversations with very esteemed museum directors. So I was a little bit off the hook, perhaps. So I was very interested in getting quite a few younger members of the profession, people who will be around for the coming decades. Secondly, um, the most important fact about the museum world is that it has gone global. And I think that is probably the single most descriptive fact about the future of the museum, that the museum is all over the world now. So I wanted to have a really global representation. And you quickly find that you need about 20, 30 to sort of even begin to say that you have a global mix. And then the last one was really a normative requirement on my part. I was very keen to show the possibility of what this field looks like when it's 50-50 men and women. So not by happenstance, we landed on exactly half men, half women in the book. And that was a signal really in the direction of where leadership patterns are evolving, because I think the future of museum leadership is going to be a lot of women directors. So those were some of the criteria, and I'm very happy almost everybody was able to respond to my request. But the other side of this was, these are the people I spent my summer with. These conversations were happening sometimes at 7 in the morning, sometimes at 10 o'clock at night. And I have to thank them for doing it, because it really was a wonderful way to survive a very difficult time.
So, and your family obviously was accommodating of calls at sort of all hours of the summer, since you were all
They
sequestered
remind me
together.
of that. They remind.
Yeah. Well, so this idea that museums have gone global. Obviously, museums have a legacy themselves. They have a history that's sort of deeply wrapped up in a colonial history, and something which is rightly being discussed and critiqued, and has been right for decades now, but has sort of reached a crescendo over the past little while here. And yet, what's so striking as you read the book, particularly as you read about institutions in other parts of the world outside of Europe and North America, is the extent to which they too are grappling with these legacies and trying to refashion these institutions within a local context, which is sort of the theme we'll be getting to over the course of this talk. So it begs the question, you have this diversity and this plurality, a word that recurs over and over again as polyphony, right? As the International Council of Museums introduced it and their revised definition of what is a museum. And yet there are also some marked consistencies. So can you just talk a little bit about the similarities that you saw that maybe you didn't expect to see in the responses, any differences that were similarly surprising, and in general, what was most surprising to you about these interviews?
Yes, I think first of all, I did not start out sort of demonstrating that now this is the museum of the future. I didn't really have a preordained sort of direction. And I have to say, it was when in August, it was time for me to put together the introduction and sort of, how should I say, sort of tie a bow on the whole book and explain sort of more or less what is in here. Even I was really surprised when I really looked at everything together, at how much certain themes echo through this book. And I don't think it's because of me, the person who was asking the question. I think it was a fairly reasonably accurate reflection of a mindset of what I like to call a generation of museum leaders. People in this book range from, well, I have to say you're at probably the youngest end. And I think the oldest one might have been perhaps 60 at the time, but the average age is mid 40s. So it's a generational portrait. And I have to say that there was a commonality of viewpoints. Now, if you're the kind of person who goes to museum conferences and reads museum journals, this would not be so striking, because there has been a movement in our field, a very earnest, I think, debate about how to open up museums, which are seen, I think, generally in society as rather fusty, somewhat elitist institutions, perhaps unfairly so. But there has been a momentum previously in the field to going in a direction of opening up museums, making them more democratic, more accommodating, more available for everybody, more open to different viewpoints, both from outside and from inside. But I think what was so powerful that in the circumstances of the pandemic, and by the pandemic, we mean the crisis of the public health system, the crisis of museum finances, and the summer-long reckoning and enduring reckoning with inequity and systemic injustice, as demonstrated by your opening statement, which I don't think a year ago we might have heard such a statement. These were really so powerful last summer, and they continue to be, that perhaps they helped align these viewpoints. And I think it comes out of two sources. One is the situation. I think that you have a generation of museum directors who find themselves kind of working on the shoulders of a previous generation who built this extraordinary international museum infrastructure. I mean, look at Toledo. It's not just your 1910 building, it's your more recent Sanaa building. Like, this infrastructure is extraordinary. And this is true whether you're the Bilbao and Guggenheim, or whether you're one of the new museums in Africa, that there is a question of like, okay, we have this great hardware. What's our software? What are our values? What is really driving all of this? The other side of it is that there's a generation that shares certain touchstones and experiences, and is informed by certain ideas. One of the interesting things that I noticed across the interviews, that the Centre Pompidou, known as the Beaubourg in Paris, this extraordinary transparent museum building, was a touchstone for so many of the directors in this book. A transparent museum, a museum you could walk through literally to get from one part of Paris to another, a museum organized by a very different set of principles, a museum that had a post office inside of it. So there are certain ideas that captivate generations. Although I must say, one of the interesting facts about this book is that both the previous and the current director of the Toledo Museum is in it. And it was Brian Kennedy who pointed out that it's a transitional generation. It's a generation that, where many members were sort of born before the internet, but now are implementing the digital museum. People who were born in the Cold War, but now negotiating the museum in this very different new environment. So it's a transitional moment, and you could sort of feel this. Now, the difference is, because maybe that's sort of your next question about how they're different. I think one of the interesting differences you stumble upon is, and perhaps one of the advantages of the new museums, brand new museums in Hong Kong, in Benin, in Togo, in Cape Town, South Africa, is that some of these new museums, often operating in very difficult parts of the world, but they have one great advantage, which is that they don't have to unlearn as much. They don't have to retrofit the existing infrastructure to put forward the new museum. They start with a more blank slate. So sometimes you found, in fact, some of the most innovative institutions outside of the global centers. And I'm particularly happy to say we have some fantastically vibrant institutions in Africa, for example.
Well, and I think, so to follow on from that, Andras, so one of the things which is striking, right, to me, right, and as someone who is in this field, but nonetheless reads this book and gets insight into 28 terrific directors all at once, is there is a live concern among each and every one of them with engaging, among each and every one of my peers with engaging local audiences, right? And it is more or less pronounced. But I think particularly some of these institutions that don't have to unlearn the ways of the past, more upstart, sort of more entrepreneurial, newer organizations, are maybe at one end of the engaging local audiences spectrum, but every institution is along that spectrum. So using your sort of software analogy, there's a global concern with the local, right? You can write a different document in Microsoft Word, right? But the idea of engaging the local is consistent, and the way people are sort of executing, the way organizations are executing
Yeah.
is different. I mean, does that sound right to you? And how do you see museums balancing that tension?
Yes. Well, and I think that you could say that there's, again, that pivot began, maybe you would have to go back to around the 1970s. And there's always been a strain of a more audience facing museum. At the end of the introduction, I bring in some examples of how people have advocated over the last century for a more democratic, more open museum. But I think that we can probably date this back to the 1970s. You know, the era of the blockbuster, the big flags outside the museum, the much more pronounced role for education department. Quite frankly, the American influence on the museum. Um, the former director of the one of them of the Met, famously titling his book "Making the Mummies Dance." Um, so there has been this strain, and part of it is also about the fact that museums increasingly began to be measured for their success in terms of the number of people that they attract. And there's a very healthy debate in our field about whether that's an accurate measure of success, you know. But overall, there has been this gradual pivot to a museum that is um, more about making sure that it offers a welcome to a wider community than just, if you will, the academic research that happens there, the care and custodianship of the objects, things that are, of course, the heart of the enterprise. But it's almost like a layer has been added on to this inner core. Now, of course, that begs the question, who is that audience? Who is that local audience? And in this respect, I think institutions like Toledo have a kind of interesting advantage because they have always been about, as it were, a local audience. You know, you're not an institution like the Guggenheim or MoMA, which has 70, 80%, I'm not exactly sure of the numbers, who are international visitors, a far more inchoate, far more abstract, complex entity. Now, in the circumstances of the pandemic, it was all people were left with. Well, I shouldn't say it because there was also a digital pivot. So you could say that that's really going out into worldwide audience. But there was a tremendous sense for museums that they have to look more locally, and actually in two ways. One was that for the foreseeable future, the local audience is the one, coupled with this very strong feeling that the museum hadn't been paying sufficient attention to relevant segments of that audience. But I would add to this also that because of the financial issues around this pandemic, museums would also need to start looking more locally in terms of their programming and their collections and their exhibitions and their permanent collections. So there has been a kind of, I don't even want to use the word narrowing because somehow that sounds like a negative term. I think it's a very healthy development because it turns out there are huge untapped opportunities in that audience. And some of that is not just an untapped opportunity, is a moral obligation to finally open up the museum to huge parts of the audience, which, if we're quite frank, are still not feeling welcome enough at the museum to show up regularly.
Well, so one of the things that I think we're thinking a lot about here, there's a few different threads in there. But one of the things sort of we're certainly thinking a lot about is sort of in the era of the blockbuster, where attendance is right your metric of success. You are inherently at a disadvantage if you are not in a major tourist center. But if your metric is sort of serving your regional audience, serving your local audience, and or deeply engaging audience. So maybe, one of the things we're thinking through is maybe the right metric is repeat visitation, where
Yeah.
you're cultivating sort of interest and content with a culture of belonging, with a sense of belonging that instigates, right, ongoing visitation from otherwise non-visitors or infrequent visitors. It almost seems as if the shoe is on the other foot. It seems that regional museums may have an advantage all of a sudden in this sort of new model, that there are lessons that other institutions can learn from museums in Toledo or Togo or beyond. So I guess the question is, we know, and digital is such a great example, that COVID has had untold terrible effects on society. It has also accelerated certain changes that were underway, like the adoption of digital and e-commerce. Do you think that this swing to regional and local audience development and engagement is a function of COVID, or do you think this is something which has now accelerated a transition that was underway to begin with?
I, there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, very few things. I mean, heat sensors at the entrance, yes, that is new. But generally speaking, it's an accelerant. I always liken this experience to a heart attack. You knew that you could eat healthier or exercise more, but boy, having that wake-up call is very helpful. But I want to push this idea of attendance because I think it's very important. Because the question is, what do we mean by attendance? And this is one of the ways that I think a re-articulation is happening, one of the strong messages of the book. Attendance shouldn't only mean silently and diligently standing in front of an artwork, studying the work, reading the label that was written for you by the curator. In fact, I think one of the big ideas in this book is to think about the museum as a place, as an important place for its community. And one of the things you do there, the most important thing you do there, is engage with art, with exhibitions, with programs, with educational opportunities. But I think this generation of museums directors is striving to put forward the museum as more than that, as a kind of place where you would just sort of go on a Wednesday to hang out. And I hate to make this analogy, and please don't misunderstand me, but when you go to a mall, there are a lot of kids who say, "What are we going to do today?" "Well, we're going to go to the mall." Are they going to go into a particular shoe store or whatever? Not necessarily. It's their public space. It's their venue. It's their third place. It's not home. It's not school. And I think here there are huge opportunities exactly for localized institutions, and especially ones like Toledo with this big campus, all this space where you can hang out. I'm a huge proponent, and there are in fact museums in this book that have co-working facilities on their museum campuses. For example, the Australian Museum of the Moving Image just reopened after a $50 million renovation. And one of the things you find there, admittedly, this is a very forward edge, innovative institution, there's a co-working space. There's Wi-Fi, there's, air conditioning in the summer, there's heat in the winter, there's cafeterias, there's people, there's interesting things that go on if you want to indulge in that. But the whole idea of sort of planting yourself in the museum it's a bigger idea. And I think that what this generation is saying is that we can't know exactly why people come. Some people are going to be pushing their grandmother on a wheelchair. Some people are going to be bringing their babies. Some people are going to be, studying up for their a vacation trip to where they're going to be snorkeling. It doesn't matter, but how can we propose the museum as this vibrant, exciting place that you could sort of go to the way you go to, let's say, a downtown area of a nice scenic small town and say, well, I could spend an afternoon there. Great things will happen. I'll get a meal. I'll see something. Maybe I'll run into people. This sort of sense of warm welcome for a proposition that includes multiple ways to spend your time in ways that are both edifying and pleasurable is, I think, something that a lot of people in the field are thinking about.
So I think of the interview with Eugene Tam in Singapore, right? And he sort of towards the end of the interview suggests that the art museum part of the museum experience will be part, not to push the mall analogy too far, of a broader set of experiences. And for those of you who are listening into this, I do think there is a legitimate categorical question, and this comes up in my interview with Andras, about what a museum is, right? And whether or not we are fashioning a new institution. And that's an unresolved question, right? That's just something that the future will sort of will dictate. So I do want to weave in here a question that came through, Andras, and I think it's a great one. The question is related to the democratization of museums since the 70s and the alignment of that with exhibitions in some ways, because those exhibitions are very expensive. And the question is, how do we reconcile entrance fees at most institutions? And the question notes that TMA is free and has been since our founding. We do charge occasionally for temporary exhibitions, for some of the reasons I've just mentioned. But how do you square entrance fees with democratization?
Not to dodge that question, first of all, I think it's wonderful if you can be free. Obviously, somebody is going to write a check for you, and whatever allows you to be free will inevitably entail costs and benefits or trade-offs, right? So if that something is a state, well, maybe you're lucky and that it's a benevolent, democratic, modern state like Germany. Maybe you're not so lucky and you're beholden to a highly politicized Ministry of Culture. If it's going to be private benefactors, well, maybe you are very lucky that you're one of the top tier institutions that has access to billionaires. Maybe you're not so lucky. But as a general rule, of course, it's nice to be free. But I would like to say this, and this is again not to dodge this question, is that I think pricing is just one of the many thresholds that institutions put at the front door. And I am thoroughly convinced that it is not the most important one. First of all, every museum that charges provides abundant opportunities, particularly for the least fortunate among us, including children, to come for free. And I don't even know any institution, I think, that doesn't offer some free days. So there are many ways around that. And there's been actually, before the pandemic, a very important trend of philanthropists picking up the cost of the door, because as every museum director knows, the box office is actually a small part of a museum's annual budget. I don't exactly know. It ranges, but it could be as little as 10% in some institutions. However, one of the things that really comes through in this book is that the real barriers to entry are, number one, does the person who go to a museum anticipate that what they find there, the stories, the objects, the narratives, have something to say to them? Will they discover themselves in the works? Will they see people who look like them on the walls? Will they be able to read the documents? Will they have people helping them relate to those works who don't look down on them? Number one. Number two, I think there are very important thresholds that are erected by museums in terms of the architecture and design of our facilities, which in their very effort to signal prestige and desirability and status and aspirational messages around culture, actually have the effect of turning a lot of people away. So my position is, sure, if you can make the numbers work with free entry, do it. But don't think that that will immediately solve the problem that 80% of people in this country don't go to museums regularly, even by the low standards of saying at least twice a year.
And just to follow on from that, there are two more questions that we'll try and weave in here, but one of them is about concrete examples of making museums more local apart from co-working spaces. So great question, and Andras, I'll give you a chance to answer it in a second, but to weave sort of an answer to that question into your answer about pricing, so free isn't free.
Right.
Someone pays for
No free
free.
lunch.
And if the model can support free admission, wonderful. But as you said, this is not conjecture, although 28 directors converging, is probably pretty strong preponderance of evidence. But in this country, at least, there is a terrific firm, LaPlaca Cohen, that does triennial longitudinal survey of cultural participation. And for those who haven't looked at it, I recommend it. And I think 2011 was maybe the first year, maybe that was the second installation. But one of the reasons, which is given, one of the top 5 reasons given in that year for not visiting cultural institutions, including museums, is I've never been invited. And that's not a lot of the structural issues and threshold resistance that need to be overcome for institutions are very difficult to address. Inviting people isn't. So one way that institutions can get more local is to structure outreach activities that are not one-offs, but that are ongoing and relationship developing in local community, where you literally take the museum outside the walls. Now, again, there's nothing new under the sun. John Cotton Dana was arguing museums should do this in the 19th century from the Newark Museum. But there are opportunities to forge greater local partnerships, I think, for institutions that leverage institutional personnel and assets outside of its walls. And I think that's, the way that manifests itself will be highly local. But we are certainly thinking a lot about ways that we can do that here in Toledo. But Andras, I didn't know if there's anything else you wanted to add specifically from the book around great examples of concretizing being more local.
I think everybody has examples for this. I mean, some of the most, I think, inspiring examples of initiatives are really around engaging audiences that aren't typically coming to the museum, or to providing services at the museum that are meaningful to a community. I mean, there's a beautiful example of this program in Miami where they invite cops and kids from the neighborhood to look at artworks together and think about why what they're looking at looks very different from the perspective of an 18-year-old youth and a policeman in that community. We actually saw some beautiful examples in the pandemic itself, the way museums became soup kitchens and COVID centers. And I was touched by a letter writing campaign undertaken by the Dresden Museum, one of the more, it's like the picture postcard version of these beautiful palaces that it's 15 museums in Dresden, the epitome of kind of royal high culture. But what were they doing? They were writing handwritten postcards to the citizens of Dresden, particularly older people, from the museum to sort of connect. Very poetic and beautiful gesture. I think 10,000 of such postcards went out. And one can go on and on. But I think it's a question of attitude. And I think what I want to say about this is that you cannot underestimate the anxiety in the field, including among board members, who are often people of an age group where they sort of came up in a different set of assumptions around culture. A great deal of anxiety that if you do these things, somehow you may dilute the enterprise. Very quickly in these conversations, you get to terms like, well, we're dumbing down, or, we're playing to the lowest common denominator, or, phrases like that. And I think the message, certainly in this book, is no, you can have it all. Like, it's not an either or. It's not like you have to sort of throw the academic rigor out the door and get rid of your objects, and now you're turning the museum into some kind of social service organization. Not at all. But that these things actually can combine hand in hand. And I do think that posture, body language, mode of address really matter. I mean, look at the Toledo Museum, because your campus provides wonderful examples of certain assumptions around what culture is. You know, I am 57 years old. I grew up in a world, actually behind the Iron Curtain, where the idea of culture was something you looked up on. I mean, we were influenced by Germany and sort of, notions of high culture. So, of course, in that model, the museum is an acropolis, a Greek temple sitting on a bank of steps. You literally physically have to ascend to earn the privilege of being able to engage with these works of art in hushed rooms behind glass. That was one model. But then and you have an example of that on your campus. It's a wonderful building. I don't want to knock it. But then further down, you have your glass center. Now, there's a reason why it's transparent, partly because of what it's showing, but it's also a paradigm of a different kind of assumption about a museum, as something that is open to the outside world. You literally can see through it. And you can also see it in combination with the nature around it. And I think that there's no question that we are moving in a world that favors that kind of transparency, that kind of link to nature. And by transparency, I don't just mean physical transparency, but institutional transparency. And this is not even a question of choice. It's just the direction of the world. And I think you see it time and again in the answers of the directors in the book.
And just to say, the other part about that Sana building I'm looking at right now is it is also human scale, right? Which is a really important part of its design. And I think, I actually think about that metaphor all the time, Andras, because in addition to being all of those things, it is also the first American building by a now Pritzker Prize winning firm. There's no diminishment of quality across the street by any stretch, right? We are simply encoding a different set of values, but clearly one that clears the threshold for exceptionalism and superlative quality. So I want to
add one thing to that, and
please, of course.
Now the viewers are getting a window into our animated dialogues. That is what we do for fun. But there's another very important thing here, which is around the idea of the campus instead of the monolithic building, and of the power of that idea. If you read the discussion in the book with the director of the garage in Moscow, which is a kind of campus. And then, of course, post-pandemic, the much greater importance of outdoor space and natural space. Almost every museum in America actually is surrounded by some green space, which is usually an afterthought. It's sort of hardscaped and there's some bushes and, nobody really thinks about it. But boy, after the pandemic, we can't ignore it. And one of the museums in this book actually is surrounded by a botanic garden. The idea of activating that space, both as a gallery space, that's essentially a space to be curated, but also as a space where you can interact with other ideas, but most importantly, as incredible public space, not just something to be crossed on the way to the entrance, but something to be appreciated in and of itself. That is I have to say, I think most museums that sort of weren't thinking about these outdoor spaces, but just as you can bet that residential design will see more terraces attached to apartments in the future, I think this sort of outward-looking museum. And again, is that a new idea? No. The Louisiana Museum in Denmark gave us that model. The Getty in Los Angeles copied that model. It's been right in front of us. But now, with a different lens after this historic experience, I think we're appreciating it in a new light.
So please keep questions coming in, everyone. So we're going to continue to weave them into our dialogue here. But I would be remiss, Andras, if I didn't ask. So we've been doing a lot of talking about benchmark examples to other museums, right? Nothing new under the sun. But actually, it's your job, and you're very good at it, at coming up with new ideas and helping organizations implement them. So what is the one thing that no museum you interviewed is doing that you think every museum should do?
Well, I would say that I would first give a meta answer to that. I think that every museum should be holding a really tough debrief on the pandemic and with internal and external and public decision maker stakeholders around why is it that we ended up in the third and fourth tier of reopening, and why were we not considered indispensable when we know from so many visitors that they consider the museum a very important part of their lives. And we know that there's simply no public health argument explaining why a museum should have opened after a hardware store or a barber shop. I think that that is something that I hope to see replicated in many communities and institutions. On the specific side, oh gosh, I could think of many, but I will say one thing. Um, I think that several museum directors in this book said the first thing I did the day after the day we closed, one of them says, I called the young kids on my digital team and I told them, you're in charge now. And what that suggests is a belated realization, again, brought to life in this heart attack of the pandemic, that we need to reorganize the business more around the centrality of digital engagement. I'm not saying that this isn't happening, but I think that what I've seen so far are mostly half-hearted attempts, because in order for something to be important, it's not just a budget, or it's not just like, oh, you have a website or you have a social media channel, but then some, the young kid is doing it from the basement or tucked away where we could find an office like after the education people. But if this is really important, then it's going to have structural implications for the organization. I mean, I like to say, perhaps glibly, that I believe that the chief digital officer's office should be next to the director's office in a museum. But look at the New York Times. I mean, I started my life out running an Institute of Cultural Journalists, right? I think today, this week, the Times announced, I think they now have 7 million digital subscribers. I mean, what the Times is today is a fundamentally different beast from what it was 15, 20 years ago. And I often compare the evolution of museums to the journey that entities like the New York Times have made. And that means there are whole new roles, whole new decision-making structures, KPIs, things that determine how we measure success that need to be put in place. So, I mean, I'll just say, maybe since you asked me a specific thing, yes, like put the CTO's office next to the director's office, I think would be a good start.
So I think that
Maybe I will get killed for this.
no.
These Zoom things are recorded now for posterity, but I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I really believe that the opportunities are humongous. I should add that before the digital transformation, which almost killed the Times, it had a subscription of about 1 million plus, and now it has 7 million plus. So, I think that there are really major opportunities here, but they won't happen by little incremental steps. I mean, eventually you have to wake up to the fact that you're operating among other things, a digital business.
Yeah, I think that generally speaking, and I'm certainly early in my career, but it does seem to me that a lot of the change management exercises at museums tend to be bolt-ons rather than going to the core and transforming from the inside out. And I think that one of the things which the word transform unfortunately does is it can imply a suddenness. Or the New York Times journey was a long one, and culture takes time, transitions take time. And a lot of the issues that museums grapple with, whether it is systemic and structural injustice or whether it is digital transformation, are going to require systemic and structural investments. We're coming down on our last 10 minutes here. I do want to ask one more question that I have before sort of transitioning to some of the Q&A that's accrued, although some of what we have here has been addressed just in the course of the conversation. So as museums sort of seek to do different things and maybe expand the purview of the activity set that they've formerly engaged, what are some industries that you think museums can learn from? So you've already spoken about publishing, which I think is quite apposite. We publish content; they're called exhibitions. But what are some of the other industries that you think museums ought to be learning from and benchmarking against?
Thank you. Well, I asked that question in the book, and I'm not going to repeat all the answers, but I will say a striking thing. I don't think when I asked the directors where do they look to, I don't think a single director mentioned another museum. I mean, there are some museums which are known to be innovators, but generally speaking, people would point to things outside the museum. And, one heard about Netflix and startups and things like that. I mean, going back to the issue of threshold resistance, I am wondering if there's more to be learned from the hospitality industries. Industries that know how to make people feel comfortable. I have a very close friend who's an architect. Who is known for making incredibly pleasant and contemporary interiors. And we talk a lot about how unpleasant it is to go in a museum. The spaces are big. They're not human scale. You mentioned human scale before. The benches, if you have them, are hard. There are few places which are really geared to sociability and togetherness. The big place where you get your food feels more like a high school cafeteria than a really pleasant place to eat, unless you're talking about your fancy restaurant, which most people can't afford. So I think there's a lot we can learn from, look at what's happened to hotels. And again, it's ironic, here we are, most hotels are currently closed, but one of the great transformations of the last couple of decades in cities has been how hotels transformed their public areas into community spaces. People go there with their laptops, people who don't stay in the hotel. I mean, when we were growing up, you only went to a hotel if you were staying there. Now people go to hotels because it's sort of where you hang out. It's a kind of public venue. I don't want to stretch this too far, but I think that there is a lot of toolkit available in the worlds of hospitality and just the general attitude of making people feel welcomed. And that means how your public facing staff is behaving. It means what your messages are like. It means how comfortable your benches are. Um, and I want to stress again, this is not to sort of turn the museum into some sort of boutique hotel. That's not what I'm talking about. I think it's about making the museum warm and welcoming and hospitable, and adopting these technologies of welcoming, which are available if we try. Just as, I might add, the commercial sector has been so good at, frankly, borrowing, if you will, stealing, copying the toolkit of museum display. If you go into Nike Town, as one of my great friends, Sandra Jackson Dumont, pointed out, I think in her interview, you will see sneakers in glass vitrines. Well, guess where they got that idea from. They got it from museums. So I think we have a lot to learn from many areas of commercial enterprise. And one that was not mentioned in the book is hospitality.
So I do want to tie that in with a question in the Q&A, and then for those who have submitted questions that we're not able to get to in the conversation, right? Actually, we should have your email as in your sign up, and maybe we can respond to you directly to keep the conversation going. But one last question from the audience, and then one last question from me to get us out of here on time.
Sure.
So 90% of museum visitors come with someone else. That is sort of a statistic which is replicated across studies. It's 92% at the Toledo Museum of Art. But visiting museum can be a solitary experience. It was certainly one of the things that those of us who were advocating for museum reopening were relying on, the sense of solace and refuge rather than sociality, right, which can be developed in a museum visit. And one of the things that hospitality does pretty well, certainly before COVID, when I was traveling around, I would hop into a hotel lobby coffee shop, pop open my laptop and do an hour of work between meetings. So hospitality's done a good job of the solitary visit. Museums actually haven't. So I just wonder, the specific question is, what have you learned about those who visit museums alone versus those who visit with others? And do you have any general observations about that?
Well, there's a literature on this. If you study, Colin Falk, I think, was the one who wrote about, one of the first thing you learn about museum studies or museum marketing or any marketing is the sort of segmentation of the audience. There is no such thing as a museum audience. There are different segments. And one of the segments in the literature is called spiritual pilgrims. You know, these are the people who come to the museum for what you just mentioned, the kind of emotional solace. You know, those are big words. Sometimes it's just somebody who wants to be left alone, you know, no kids, no husband, an hour to myself. You know, I just want to sit in front of a painting and be left alone with my thoughts. And in fact, museums have learned that those people, for example, like to sit down in front of paintings, and that those people need to be accommodated. And I think that we need to think about those people as one of the many ways in which we think about what our public actually craves and wants. And, you know, many museums, I live in New York, we have some museums that are somewhat the victims of their own success. It feels like a train station when you go there. It's important to think about oases of calm and comfort in a museum. Now, a museum like Toledo has been perfectly placed in that respect, so that you make sure that those people, that those experiences are available and people want them. There are a lot of people. This is a very significant part of the audience, actually, who crave this. And whatever we do, it would be a mistake to just making the mummies dance. Now, this is not just an exercise in turning the museum into some sort of carnival attraction. I think that the trick of leadership is to find ways to make different segments of the audience happy. I will mention in this regard, one of the funniest things well, it's not funny, one of the things I heard in the course of writing this book, which I'd never heard before, was somebody said, well, if a very significant portion of our visitors are children, I don't know, at the TMA, what percentage of the visitors are children?
I actually don't know that number offhand, but our student visitors alone would make up about 10%.
There are many museums where up to half of the visitorship is actually children coming in on buses. So this person said, well, if half of our visitors are children, why is everything hung, you know, at eye level for an adult? I mean, that's not catering to your audience. So why aren't there galleries where children could, for example, see works at their eye level? I mean, it's part of the same story, which is museums. And this is again where maybe commercial enterprises have been smarter. We need to think about who are our visitors and what are their needs, whether those needs are physical. And I'd like to commend you for your well-earned article the other day for making Toledo one of the most hospitable institutions for differently abled people. Whether those needs are physical or spiritual, it doesn't matter. What matters is the museum thinking about it and trying to accommodate those needs of the visitorship? Because I think when you are known to do that across the board, you're going to see more people coming to the museum.
Well, there are many more questions we could ask Andras, and he and I have been known to go on forever. We are at 1 o'clock, so I can't think of a better or more hopeful way to end our conversation as we look forward to a field which is in transition, but is in transition towards greater inclusivity, towards broader thinking about our potential and our prospect for impact, even if, as you said, Andras, we need to rethink how we articulate it so that society and policymakers value it as much as those of us in the field do. There is nothing but upside to what museums can do in their communities. And one of the things about this book, which is so exciting for me and for those of us in the field, I think, is it opens up the door to the fact that maybe, just maybe, the right benchmark, the right partner for the Toledo Museum of Art is in Sao Paulo rather than in Baltimore or in Worcester. Not to say we don't want to partner with those organizations, but we've expanded the purview of the type of learning that museums should be doing. And we can now look for global examples that lead the way and how we can engage local audiences. So Andras, thank you for your time. Thank you all for being with us. And thank you for this book, which provides an unbelievable snapshot into this industry at a defining moment in its development. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day. And thank you, Andras.
Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.